Okay, Brother Adam is here. I've just been showing your book. I want you
Oh,
to
sweet. Good.
I want you to mark me down as having read your book.
Okay, that's good.
I mean, like your other book, The Mystery is History. Everything you need to know is in this little book. And if you can't stand that, this is one you need. I use it all the time.
I don't even know if I have any more of those to sell. Yeah,
Well,
so
that's all right. We'll just PDF it and send it to everybody free.
there you go. Yep. All right, let me close these blinds. Hold on one second.
Go ahead. I just want to tell you, thanks for being here. I've been looking forward to it. You're going to be here next week too, I think.
Yeah, I believe so. Sorry I'm late. I put a calendar reminder on my thing and I'm looking at my phone now and I don't even see it. So
You missed
apparently
the
it decided
box.
not to remind me.
Just
Okay, so how much time do I have?
all you want, but usually about 45 minutes.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to go over this a little bit. Who else do you know has had this already? They probably don't know about this book except for the link that's in there, I assume now, right?
I don't know, Steve.
I don't have the book, but I heard your speaking engagements on it at Sukkot.
That's right. Yep.
And I was actually so impressed with it. I ran right to Dr. Snyder and said, we've got to get you on here because this is critical information
Yeah.
to the body of
All
believers.
right, I'm going to get the link up here.
So very, very brief background. This will help explain the purpose of the book. I'm sure all of us have known people that have fallen away from faith, right? It's obviously a very disheartening and painful thing to have to go through. And oftentimes, as it did with me, it kind of leads us into areas of study in our life to introspect and to find out, to look into why did that happen, right? So we had some very close friends of ours that were part of our fellowship. It seems like it was over a year, maybe even a year and a half now, that they just decided to just walk away from everything. For lack of a better term, they kind of studied themselves out of the faith. To me, it was done with a degree of ignorance, and it just wasn't fully studied out. But they had already gotten to the point where it was too far gone. One of the reasons, just for everyone here, I'm not what would be called an inerrantist, right? So the Bible that we read every day was compiled over thousands of years and has obviously been touched by the hands of men. It's clear that that's happened. So we can't expect perfection, in my opinion, from something that has a history like that. Having said that, obviously we know that it is still exceedingly reliable, and the fact that we have it today to begin with is a miracle in and of itself. So when somebody walks into the knowledge of the scriptures and studying them, especially with the New Testament, you can't walk into it with the belief that everything you're getting ready to read is perfection. If it were, there wouldn't be a science called textual criticism today, which is essentially the study of all the manuscripts to determine which ones are the most accurate. Now, the genesis then of this book was to study myself and to introspect as to, can I prove why I believe in the resurrection? Because in the end, anyone who holds to a faith in Yeshua as the Messiah, the core belief that we have that underlies that entire thing is the resurrection. If that goes away, then all the claims that relate to him, all his own claims, all of his followers whose writings we read to this day, all go away. And even as Paul said, I heard someone mention Paul a minute ago, but even as Paul said, we are to be pitied above all. If that's the case, we would be holding to faith in eternal life through a man whose bones long ago decayed and blew away with the wind. And so, my opinion on that, right? So anyways, I spent then the next several months, Jackson, I'm going to put a different website in there now. Beapologetic.com is going to take a while. My new one is livelikeyeshua.com, and I have some posts on there, and I'm going to have a little store on there with some merchandise and stuff to sell. And I plan on putting a lot of my books and or messages and stuff I've done in the past and studies up there in small blog posts that are very digestible. So definitely subscribe to that if you guys get a chance. Anyway, so the book, I spent the next several months after that happened really digging into my faith and determining whether I could actually prove what I believe. If I'm asked, hey, did Yeshua exist, or why do you believe anything the New Testament says? Did I have answers to those questions? And I didn't. That didn't mean it diminished my faith or I was getting ready to walk away, because I believe that there are two vitally important aspects of a relationship with the Messiah. One, of course, it does involve us knowing how to prove our faith as much as is possible with what we have available to us. And of course, the other is an actual relationship. And that needn't be understated. The existential relationships that we each individually have with the Father and with the Messiah are vitally important for us to be able to stick with them through the difficult times that we all go through in life. I'm sure we can agree with that. So as a part of the studies of this, I listened to probably dozens and dozens of debates between atheists and other Christians about the resurrection, about whether God exists. And honestly, if you haven't done that before and really heard some pretty knowledgeable atheists out there, there's good arguments, to be honest with you, that they have to be able to present. And it takes, if you're ever going to go and listen to any of those debates or anything, just be prepared to open your mind up to being able to say, that argument I used to give is really just not that powerful. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that you got to face the truth and come up with, what really is true. So this particular book is written, I'm going to go through briefly what's contained in it because there's a lot of details in it. It's written in a very small fashion, and it was intended to be that. It's only 115 pages or something, because I wanted to write it focused specifically towards students that are high school age, getting ready to go into college. Of course, adults can use it to help solidify their faith and so forth. But the statistics of kids that start out as believers in Yeshua, traditional Christians, of course, mostly, that leave their faith within the first year of going to college is quite stunning. It's probably over 70%. And a lot of that is because churches today don't spend much time discipling, and they don't spend much time focusing on what it looks like to actually establish a foundation of your faith based not only in the scriptures, but in history and other things that are important. So, it's important for us to teach our children and to be able to have a resource that they can provide. So the goal was to have a book that they could just carry around in their backpacks at school or whatever. And some atheist comes up to them and says, oh, the New Testament wasn't written by blah, blah, therefore, you can't believe a word. So there's several proofs. The book is divided mainly into two sections. The first section involves the reliability of the New Testament as a whole and determining what that is. Because if we can't even establish a reliability of the documents that we're reading to establish our faith in the resurrection, then what good are the documents to begin with, right? Now, again, textual critics today will make it very clear that we have thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, the majority of them are very, very fragmentary. Most people would be surprised to know that the ones that are considered the most trusted and reliable sources are actually hundreds of years older than when the apostles and Yeshua himself walked the earth. Many would also be surprised to find out that age does not mean accuracy. So there's a great book, and I reference it in here. It's called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism. If you have not read it or checked it out from a library, I highly recommend that. I can put the name of that in the chat a little later, just so everyone has it. But it really does do a good job of breaking down the walls of what the myths that exist behind manuscripts. You'll hear common statements such as, "Oh, there's 15,000 manuscripts in the Latin and in the Syriac and all this other stuff," and it's just numbers people throw out there to try to substantiate their faith. Which, okay, that's fine, but you got to understand that the numbers don't mean as much as what someone might think. So the first part of the book is going in to establish that, and I don't know if you guys can see this or not. It's probably pretty bright, but let me turn off this other monitor here. This might help. There we go. Okay, so this book has these little stop hands in it, and the stop hand corresponds, it has a number that's inside, and it corresponds to an objection that's in the back of the book. And the objections are addressed specifically to things that I heard constantly coming up through different debates. So, for example, I have the objections written in a statement format. And the one that I was just referring to, talking about the age of manuscripts, the objection is titled, "Even though we have manuscripts that are very early relative to other ancient works, the earliest one we have is still dated 70 to 100 years after the events. All we have are copies of copies of copies, far removed from the originals." All of us here have probably heard of a New Testament scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman. He has many books he's written, obviously, and one of the ones that he uses that exact phrase, "All we have are copies of copies of copies." And so I go through in detail what it looks like to contest that particular argument. So in some, let's see, some of the quick facts, I have it set up here as well, where there's some quick facts sections. I'm trying to get this to work here. You guys can't probably see that, but there's a quick facts section here. It's meant to be a kind of a little reference guide, right? And some quick facts that are important is there's about 5,100 to 5,300 Greek extant Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. The oldest one dates from 125 AD, which is just a tiny little fragment, like a credit card size. There are 138,000 words in the New Testament, roughly. And get this, 500,000 variants within the manuscripts, 500,000, which that number on its own would equate to about 3.5 variants per word. And that's where atheists, as an example, will rise up and say, "Oh, this, how can you trust a manuscript that's got so many variants?" Well, 99.5% of those variants are small grammatical differences between English and Greek. Things that we would never even translate. Like sometimes they'll put the definite article "the" in front of proper names. So it'll be like "the Yeshua" or "the Abraham." And clearly that doesn't translate into English. And then there's any number of other things as well. So once you bring it down, you only actually have about 2,500 total variants amongst 138,000 words. So roughly in that section, it's safe to say that the manuscripts themselves, from an ancient history perspective and how manuscripts are maintained, are very accurate in the contrast. Now, some of the other things, just little side points here, that's another argument that's presented, is none of the Gospels are signed. None of them have signatures, and that's absolutely true. None of the Gospels we have today say, "I, Matthew, wrote this." Even John, that has some statements toward the end of it that says that the blessed apostle wrote this, doesn't really name who that person is. However, traditionally speaking, in every single manuscript that we have in any language that exists all time, if it has a signature or a name on it, they always are consistently those four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So there's not any single witness in history that points to any other author other than those four. So those types of arguments are very powerful because no one's going to be able to present anything that's going to override what we have from tradition. Other aspects that are demonstrate accuracy. Let me stop there for just a second though and see if anyone has any questions. Does anyone want to speak up on anything? No? Okay. All right, so then arguments from silence. This is actually a very interesting, you guys have all heard this before too, but when you listen to debates or discussions between different people, and something is stated, sometimes somebody will say, well, that's an argument from silence, and immediately it's dismissed. The problem with that is that arguments from silence can actually be valid, but there's certain requirements to look at them. For instance, and these are the two that are defined, and I have references, of course, in the back of the book for all of these quotes and stuff that I give, but essentially an argument from silence is valid if the author of whatever events that surround it or are very similar to it made a concerted effort to record events of the same style in his work, and that the event itself would have been so affected on the mind of the author that, and under any other circumstance, you would expect it to have been written down. Some of the most poignant examples of this that are mentioned in the book are the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. They are found nowhere within the pages of the New Testament, especially the book of Acts. The book of Acts itself records the lives and the ministries of several apostles. Of course, Paul is included in there. But even though it gets into specific details that are very tertiary, that are just passed over, like, oh, we traveled to this city by this name and we met this prophet, and then he just skips right past it as if it's nothing. Those little details point towards historical truth, because there's no other reason for some writer of fiction to randomly put these names in there, drop them like spice, and then just walk away. So we would fully expect from the way that that Luke recorded the events and how detailed he got in there about small little things, about how there were the shipwrecks and the how Festus took over the role from Gessius Florus and he died, and then all that different stuff. You would expect to see something as impactful and significant as the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple written in his works, if that indeed happened, especially when you have things like the event of the Jews getting exiled from Rome is found in there as well. And that was notably much less significant of an event than the destruction of the entire Jewish Commonwealth. So, but that's not even the most powerful. In fact, that's probably the weakest of all of the arguments from silence that one would expect. Probably the most powerful argument from silence that we can pull out that helps us to date the New Testament itself are the lack of mention of the martyrdoms of a couple key players in the Bible. Now, regardless of what anyone thinks about Paul, he obviously had a significant impact on early Christianity in some fashion, and took a very significant role in the book of Acts towards the end. And his death is found nowhere. Likewise, the death of Peter is found nowhere. Likewise, the death of the bishop, first bishop of Jerusalem, James the Just, is found nowhere in the pages of Scripture. Yet we find that written in Josephus' historical writings. If anyone you'd expect to read those and to write those, it would be the authors of the New Testament, who clearly James had a much more significant impact on than anyone else, and yet we don't find them. So the long story short of that entire section of the book is to bring into contrast or into scope the dating of the documents of the New Testament and how impactful that is to understanding what's written inside of it. In my personal opinion, based on my own studies, I don't think any of the documents of the New Testament were written after the year about 68 AD. In my opinion, I think that obviously the book of Revelation, based on my other works, was written probably around 66 or so. And before that, the Gospel of John was probably the nearest one to that. Okay, so in addition to that, we also have evidence that helps us to date the New Testament and to underlie its veracity based on archaeological evidence, which I go over, and I have several pictures of different pieces of archaeological evidence. I feel like I have to block this screen. So there's pictures of all kinds of things in here. I got it printed on higher quality paper so I can show all the ossuaries and so forth. And every single one of these little ossuaries that exist, every piece of evidence that's been unearthed so far, corroborates the record in the New Testament we have of certain things. So Caiaphas, obviously, we know was a high priest that was a part of the trial of Yeshua to condemn him. As a high priest, you would fully expect him to be buried in a bone box or an ossuary that is very detailed, ornate, and beautiful. And that's exactly what we have in the archaeological record. So a bone box was discovered in Israel that has on the side of it has Yosef Bar Kefa. And in the tomb in which it was found, there were two ossuaries with the name Caiaphas on it, but only one of them had Yosef. And out of all of the things, there's this beautiful ornate ossuary with the name Joseph Caiaphas on it. And that same exact name is testified and mentioned twice in the writings of Josephus as well. So very, very powerful archaeological evidence there. Of course, you guys are probably intimately familiar with the James ossuary, which says James, brother of, or James, son of Joseph, brother of Yeshua. There was a 5-year trial that went on for that, which ended up exonerating the person who was accused of forgery, where, again, out of all of the statistics of, despite the commonality of the names Jacob, Joseph, and Yeshua in the first century, the combination of those three only yields about, on average, 1.7 people, which of course you can't have a portion of a person. And then if you equate the fact that Yeshua obviously had greater reputation than any other Yeshua that was probably in his day, you really have to limit that down to who was this James that was in this bone box. Other artifacts are like the Pilate stone, which had Tiberius. Before this, there was no archaeological evidence proving that Pontius Pilate actually existed, that this particular tablet proved that he existed. The pool of Siloam was discovered recently. It was beautiful. You can see pictures of it in the book that have it empty and then filled with water. The pool of Bethesda, the Nazareth inscription, several other aspects of that are very powerful pieces of evidence. Any questions so far?
Yes. On the second Caiaphas ossuary, did that have a first name on it? Was that Miriam? Do you remember?
I don't know. I know that I don't think it had a first name on it, but I think they saw Caiaphas as kind of a family name, and so that's why it was on multiple ones.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so then you have the corroboration of various other historical writings, such as Tacitus and Suetonius and Pliny the Younger. I have quotes in there from here, and again, when you're reading an apologetic like this or listening to anything, you have to remember that there's not going to be a single piece of evidence that can prove anything in history, anything, regardless if it's the existence of Yeshua, the destruction of the temple. No one is alive today that can testify to those things. So the same kinds of evidence that scholars and theologians have available to them to interpret history are the same ones that every single one of us on this meeting have to interpret. You just need to go to those works and read them. And so, you're not looking for any type of argument, whether it's about the resurrection or whatever, to say, boom, here's this piece of evidence that proves it. No questions asked. It's a cumulative case. And so the purpose of this book, and I mention it as you're going through it several times to remind the reader, it's not about a single piece of evidence. It's about the full collection of evidence from beginning to end. What is the most reasonable conclusion? If you're an investigator and you have all this evidence that you can compile, what's the most reasonable conclusion you would draw with all that evidence? Is it that this man Yeshua didn't exist, there was no resurrection, there was no crucifixion, didn't really die, and there was no resurrection? Or do the evidence point to the resurrection? And what, if anything, then withholds somebody from believing in that? And my personal conclusion at the end of it is that the only thing that would withhold anyone from believing that Yeshua is resurrected from the dead after understanding and seeing all the evidence is whether they believe in the possibility of miracles at all. If someone doesn't believe a miracle is possible, then unless they see it themselves, to me, you're not going to convince them in any fashion. So it's just, that's one of the things that the Spirit has to work in somebody's heart. So there's also things, there's something called the criteria of embarrassment. And what that means is that it's unlikely for an author of any ancient work to write something that is notably against their own credibility, unless it were true. So, for instance, the authors of the New Testament and the Gospels, call the Messiah a glutton and a drunkard, or they say that he was accused of that. Peter, who ends up as being the foundation of the church later, right, the rock upon which it's built, is shown as having denied the Messiah 3 times. Amongst many other things. I mean, the disciples had this exceeding difficulty in believing in who he was, even after his resurrection, showing himself. It still says at the end of the book of Matthew that some believed and some didn't. So, why do you put these things in here if they speak negatively about your movement or about your Messiah or your leaders, unless it's something that's just true and you're just recording the truth? I think a good example as well is in the book of Acts, chapter 15, where the apostles and other disciples are arguing about, whether believers had to be circumcised in order to achieve salvation. And, why would you record this huge argument, this big dispute? Why not just record that everything was in perfect unity and everyone had all knowledge and so forth? Something you would expect from a work of fiction that's not there. Okay, so then other pieces of evidence that are contained in the book for the reliability of the New Testament are geographical evidence, the number of locations that are, there's a table in here, 2 tables. I wish I could get you guys to see this. Hold on a second, let me minimize this. There we go, maybe that's better. There's a couple tables in here that show just the vast number of locations that are found and mentioned by name in the New Testament and the Gospels, and some of them are tiny little towns and they're only mentioned 1 time. The nearest thing to it in other works, like the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, they only mention the main cities that anyone in any nation at that time would have been familiar with, like Caesarea and Jerusalem. So the fact that these tiny little towns, they speak to the truth of the documents themselves, they speak to the truth of the history recorded in there, because there's no viable reason for them to have been recorded unless the person's just recording history. A very powerful piece of evidence is about the early dating of the Gospels comes from personal names. So statistics show that there's a guy named Richard Bauckham. If no one's ever read some of his works, he's very good in writing this one. He's called a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. That's very good. In that book, he talks about, he records the most common names. He did research in manuscripts and archaeological evidence between the years 50 BCE and 135 CE, compiling all that stuff. And essentially, he said that the most common male name at the time was Simon. Other ones up there were Joseph, Jacob, of course, Yeshua. Matthew was very common. So in the New Testament, to show that this is an important aspect, because a lot of times atheists or skeptics will say that the New Testament documents were written hundreds of years afterwards in other countries and so forth. However, in order for that to be even plausible, you'd have to explain how the authors of the Gospels got the statistics about the names perfectly accurate to what was actually in society in the archaeological and documentary record. As an example, Matthew 10:2-4 goes through the list of the names of the 12 apostles. And what you'll notice in this place, as well as many other places in the New Testament, that names that are the most common are disambiguated, which means that it'll say like Simon, who is called Peter, Jacob or James, the son of Zebedee. Instead of just saying James, because it's so common, or Jacob, they'll say the son of Zebedee. Or next one is Jacob, the son of Alphaeus, and Judah or Judas Iscariot. So Simon the Cananean. These little disambiguations of names, Miriam, the mother of Yeshua versus Miriam Magdalene, these types of disambiguations show that the author knew he had to provide that information to distinguish between people. That's just more evidence of the accuracy. Now, one of the most powerful evidences of the originality of the Gospels, and how they, even though Mark may have been the earliest written, and Matthew and Luke probably used him as source material to show the independence of the Gospels between one another, are things called undesigned coincidences. If you've ever heard of undesigned coincidences before, just make a little note real quick in the chat. I'm just interested if anyone has ever heard of them. Undesigned coincidences are differences between two gospel accounts that explain one another, that you would not know the full truth of that message or that story if it weren't for both gospel writers. But neither one of them mentioned all the facts. For example, I'll give you some very simple examples. So if anyone were to have called themselves a king in opposition to Kaiser in the first century, that would have been considered a crime against Roman law. Pilate tried Yeshua and asked him directly, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And in Luke 23, Yeshua replies in the affirmative, "You say that I am." Yes. And yet, immediately after that passage where he acknowledges that, he says he leads the Yeshua back out to the Jews and says, "I find no guilt in this man." How is that possible? How is it possible that he is acquitting Yeshua of this guilt of committing treason against Kaiser by calling himself king? You don't find that answer in the Gospel of Luke at all. However, John, as an independent author, answers the question for us in chapter 18, where we read that Yeshua tells Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." So essentially, Yeshua was not a threat to the Roman Empire, because he wasn't claiming to have a kingdom that he was planning on taking over or ruling over anyone in the Roman Empire. Many of us would probably be very familiar with the story where Yeshua was on trial before the Jews, and somebody struck him, right? And you read in one of the Gospels where somebody asks him, tell us, Yeshua, who struck you? That's, if you stop and think about it, that's just with that account. That's in Matthew 26. That's a very strange question to ask. Of course you would know who struck you, right? It's right in front of your face. Why would you even ask that question? Well, in a separate gospel, you read where Luke tells us that Yeshua was blindfolded. Now, all of us probably put those two and two stories together now, having read the New Testament several times and so forth. And so to us, it's just one unified story. But if you understand that the documents of the New Testament are independent manuscripts, they're not one solid delivered from heaven type of thing, then you'll see how powerful it is to have the question in one gospel answered by one in a completely different gospel, but neither one of them have both parts of the scenario. So let's see if there's another really good one. Okay, so here's an interesting one. This is probably the longest one that I have. If in John's gospel, we see that Yeshua tells Pilate that his kingdom's not of this world, otherwise his servants would fight. Later in the same gospel, as well as in Matthew and Mark, Peter is found, doing that exact thing, fighting, right? He slices off the high priest's servant's ear and so forth. Peter took out a sword, cut off the ear. John is the only gospel who names that person. His name is Malchus. Later in the Gospel of John, Peter actually meets the kinsman of Malchus. And if anyone was going to be upset at Malchus's ear being cut off, it would have also been a family member, you'd think, right? So why in the trial of Yeshua did the Jews have to present false witnesses against him when they had Malchus, all of the people that were in the garden of Gethsemane, and one of his own relatives that could have stood right before the trial and said, nope, we saw him be violent and so forth. Well, Luke's gospel answers the question for us by saying that Yeshua, he's the only gospel that mentions it, that Yeshua's healed Malchus's ear. So think about it now as it relates to the trial. Malchus, if he were brought to trial, would have confessed in front of everyone that Yeshua was a miracle-working, merciful healer, which is exactly the opposite of what the Jews wanted. So of course they're not going to present this witness because it would have actually promoted what Yeshua's actual message was. So anyway, there's several more. I have several undesigned coincidences that look in these nice little diagrams here that go back and forth with the different gospels and who corroborates who. Very easy to understand. So those are really powerful things. Highly recommend looking at that. In addition to that, there's contemporary historical accuracy that's very powerful. There's 21 points. I'm not going to go through them, but there's 21 points and facts found in the Gospels and in Acts that are directly corroborated in Josephus's writings or in other historical writings at the time that make it very clear that the author of the book of Acts and the Gospels were living in history at the time that this stuff happened and wrote what they saw. Okay, so in all of my conclusion about all those little facts is that the Gospels are very historically reliable, that if you were to use all the information you have there and compare it even to the next closest historical work that you have that has any attestation close to it at all, the New Testament just blows it out of the water. Okay, before I go into the last section here and discuss the resurrection portion of this, I would just stop one more time here and see if anyone has any comments or questions. Okay, cool. All right, so the second main section of the book is discussing the resurrection itself. Now, the resurrection as a whole is a topic that's not outlined or spoken of very frequently in the Old Testament. Of course, there's several passages that do talk about it, but it's not something that's laid out anywhere near as in depth or robustly as it is in the New Testament and other even intertestamental writings before the New Testament was written. So the first thing I do in this is to put together a timeline of the burial and resurrection accounts that bring several of what atheists and skeptics call discrepancies and contradictions together. And again, I'm going to emphasize this. imagine for a second you are a homicide detective and you have multiple witnesses to the event. Let's forget homicide for a second and think bank robbery. So you have at least, let's say, 3 people, maybe. You have a door greeter at the bank that sees who this man or woman is that's coming to rob the bank, and is able to give a generalized description of them later to the police officers, maybe the color of his shirt, color of his pants, color of his skin, whether he's wearing a hat or not, right? When he walks up to the teller, he has a pistol in his hand that no one else can see except for the teller. And the teller can describe his face in great detail, whether he had a beard or any marks on his face that would distinguish him. However, the front desk person that's just sitting there doing their job, helping people out, is behind him and doesn't see the gun. From his or her perspective, looks like a very nice person. There's nothing going wrong at all. All of those people are going to have completely different stories and tales to tell about that individual. Now, when an investigator goes to try to piece together what happened as a part of that bank robbery, he's going to interview each of those people, and assuming that he segmented them and they weren't colluding with one another, you could get drastically different stories. And it's the job of the detective to actually piece those together to get the full picture of what actually transpired. And this happens with, of course, homicides and everything else. And that's exactly why homicide detectives, one good one that wrote a book called Forensic Faith and Cold Case Christianity, his name is J. Warner Wallace. He was a cold case detective, and he'll tell you that, and I have friends that fellowship with us that are police officers and investigators today, who will tell you that you don't want to have accounts that agree. Otherwise, it leads you immediately to the conclusion that people were colluding together. So the fact that you have apparent to emphasize that, contradictions and or distinctions in accounts within the Gospels is actually an amazing blessing. If you had the exact same account in all 4 Gospels, it would actually point towards it being more collusion and non-historical. So given that, I actually do a kind of unification of the burial and resurrection accounts amongst the 4 different Gospels to piece the stories together in a way that I think is very logical, ordered, and takes into account all of the different aspects, such as one account says there were 2 angels, another one says there was 1. Some say it was a young man that was seated, some say they were standing, and so forth. And I think there's a way, based on the number of aspects and views and the people that were being interviewed for this record, that allows them to be unified in a pretty good way. And I'll let people who have read the book testify as to whether they think that it's compiled in that type of fashion. So after that, I go through what I believe to be the salient facts necessary and available to everyone in history, or everyone in modern times and in history, to be able to find and research themselves. The first fact that's very important to establish is that Yeshua was crucified to begin with. Now, believe it or not, there are people that do not believe that he was crucified. Of course, there's some that don't even believe that he exists. I don't address his existence in the book because it's absolutely foolish to think that he didn't. If anyone is ever interested, there is a blog written by an atheist historian. His name, God, I don't even remember his name. It's called historyforatheists.com. On his site, he has like a 7 or 8 section or independent articles on Jesus mythicism, and where he just absolutely blows any mythicist argument out of the water. And this is coming from an atheist perspective, where he just uses the historical record to just prove without a question that Yeshua was a true man who existed. Now, he obviously doesn't believe he's the Messiah and disagrees with the Gospel's portrayal of him. But the fact that he existed is pretty beyond dispute. So there are several historical testimonies to the fact that he was condemned to crucifixion. Josephus and Tacitus are the two primary ones, obviously. Now, the other, instead of having objections addressed in the back during the resurrection section here, I address them as I go through, because it's very important for one of the several reasons. For instance, as it relates to the resurrection, there are actually people that question whether he died. Muslims, for instance, don't believe that he died on the cross. There's others who believe that in what's called the swoon theory, where he only appeared dead, was placed in the tomb, and these are the types of things that you have to be able to argue against very succinctly. And so, like, as it relates to the swoon theory, just as an example, you're talking about a man who is admitted to have been crucified, who was flogged beforehand, great degrees of blood loss, was tortured, and he was sealed into a tomb with a stone that was rolled and blocked on one side with they would put a corner piece of wood to prevent the stone from re-rolling back out, and sealed by the Roman authorities and guarded by Romans on the outside, a number of which is not really mentioned. So to believe in the swoon theory and the empty tomb being explained as a result of him leaving the tomb on his own volition, you also then have to prove that a man who was just taken off the cross, who had lost all that blood, was able to be in an empty, dark tomb for, at the minimum, 36 hours with no food, no water, and had enough strength to overcome not only all the Roman guards outside, but the door to make it out to begin with, right? So some of these arguments people just don't have in their mind when it comes to proving the resurrection, because they don't see it as a proof. But in this, what this is it's another piece of evidence to support the question of, well, what else could it have been if it wasn't the resurrection? So these are the types of questions you have to compile. The next salient fact that I list was the fact that Yeshua was buried. Many people actually believe, I think John Dominic Crossan is one of the Jesus Seminar, that Yeshua was not actually buried, or that he was just buried as a common criminal. It is historically accurate that a lot of times when Romans would crucify people in the past, they would have the crosses much lower, despite the pictures you see on Catholic paintings and so forth, the cross would be much lower to the ground, where the shame of a crucifixion as a death penalty continued even after the person's death, where dogs would pick apart their body and their bones would fall off, and it would just be shame after shame after shame as a part of this. However, historically speaking, there is actually in the historical record archaeological evidence to prove that crucified victims were allowed to have honorable burials and placed even in ossuaries. There's a discovery in 1968 by an archaeologist that found a bone box that had a nail pierced through the heel that couldn't be pulled out, apparently, and so he's buried along with it. Yeah, Jackson has a good point there. In university, some professors teach there's no body of Yahshua because he was eaten by dogs. Totally agree. And that's actually one of the, John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar actually believes that as well. And I mention him in here and give a reference to where he writes that. So Josephus actually, and I think it's Josephus or Philo, or maybe a couple of them, actually state as well that even in the time of the Romans, that they would allow them to bury their dead according to their own law, which of course there's only, it's ironic and interesting, there's only one law, there's really no other laws relating to burial in the Torah, except as it relates to one thing, and that's when somebody is hanged on a tree. And so the Jews would use that, and they would be able to allowed to bury their dead who were hanged as a result of crucifixion. Okay, so then the next fact is the empty tomb. So believe it or not, the fact that the tomb was empty is not as disputed as some might think. It's just the reasons why that people have problems with. But it's also interesting that the empty tomb is not as significant of a point as some like to make it out to be. None of the disciples were convinced by seeing the empty tomb that he had been raised from the dead. They were just, as far as the last thing we knew, is that they were either one, upset, like Miriam Magdalene was, by thinking that the body had been stolen, right? Her first reaction after being told that all those years that he was going to, he told them what his message was about being, crucified, died, buried, and raised again. The first thought that came to her mind was that his body was stolen. It wasn't, oh man, he's raised, his promise was fulfilled. The empty tomb didn't prove to be something that was very impactful to prove the resurrection. But needless to say, it obviously is just yet another piece of evidence that we have to show that there was something very powerful that happened. Now, again, from an addressing issues perspective here, there are several theories that are presented. One is that somebody moved the body. Joseph of Arimathea is one of the primary ones, as well as the disciples themselves. But again, you got to look at motives here. Joseph goes through all the trouble of petitioning Pilate to bury somebody in his brand new tomb, which by the fact of having a dead body in it defiles it already. Why would he suddenly have a conscience at the next day, shortly thereafter, go past the Roman guards, convince them to open the tomb, steal the body of Yeshua out, reseal the tomb, and put the Roman seal back on it again, and no one knows anything about it? It's absolutely ludicrous to think that it's even plausible. The same thing happens when you think about it with the disciples. And there's, when it comes to establishing the truth, for apologetics or defending your faith on anything, on any fact, we have to look at Occam's razor, right? You either have to compound theories together to try to explain the empty tomb in a very convoluted, difficult way, but the simplistic explanation is the fact that he was raised from the dead. And you have all this historical record and testimony in the New Testament to show that, but it takes so many compounding of different arguments to prove against it that it just becomes inviable. So the body being stolen is one. Another one is that the body of Yeshua would have already been decayed. Well, the argument goes basically that if, essentially think about it, all you had to do as a Jew, as soon as you started hearing rumors of somebody being raised from the dead, is go to the tomb where you knew where it was, open it, pull out some bones, and show it to people. And any bones at all would have made some form of statement. Oh, here's bones. It could have been some random guy that just died, that was buried, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ahead of time, and they show him, say, here's his bones and whatever. At least something would have made some form of argument, but there's zero record that ever happened. And even if it had happened, the people would have been, people would say, oh, the body was too decayed, they wouldn't have brought it out because no one would have recognized it. It's how hard would it have been to recognize a skeleton of a crucified man, roughly the same height of who Yeshua was, buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb in the 1st century. It's just unreasonable to think that if they would have presented that people would have done it. And yet no body was presented. No attempt to do that was even made, which speaks testimony of itself. Another alternate theory that's presented is that the location of the tomb was forgotten, which is just ludicrous because the women themselves wanted to know where it was. They wanted to return the next day to anoint the body and to do the normal burial rituals. So, and even if they randomly did forget it, think about the number of people that existed that were still alive that could have just told them right away. Oh yeah, the Jews knew where it was. The Roman guards knew where it was. Anyone who put the seal on there knew where it was. Of course, Joseph of Arimathea would have known where his own tomb was. So that's an inviolable theory as well. Okay, so now the most powerful piece of evidence that we have that proves or is a proof for the resurrection of Yeshua is kind of twofold. The appearances of Yeshua to the disciples and others, and the faith that resulted as a result that still exists to this day. Paul, like him or hate him, believe it or not, is probably one of the most powerful witnesses that we have for the resurrection. And the reason is because of something that even in court today is known as, adverse testimony. So there's a law, I have it referenced in here. I can't remember. I have it, let's see. Yeah, okay, it's called, so definition of something called hearsay, right? So hearsay is, by definition of Black's Law Dictionary, is a statement other than one made by the declarant while testifying at the trial or hearing, offered in evidence to prove the truth of the matter asserted. In other words, Joe Schmo talked to Sally outside of court. Joe then testifies that he heard Sally say something. That's hearsay. It's not admissible. However, it is admissible if what Joe says out of his mouth is actually detrimental to himself, because people don't stand on trial. Like, let's just say you had somebody who was part of a organized crime, and they stand on trial and they admit something that they know is going to put them in jail for 10 years, right? There's no benefit to them doing that unless they're telling the truth. And so even in courts of law today, there's something called a statement against interest. It's the hearsay rule. If it's enemy attestation, it's something that goes against the good of the person that's testifying, the court will allow that form of hearsay to be there. So Paul, numerous times to his own detriment, testified in his conversion from being against Yeshua to now believing in him, despite the fact that he knew he was going to be punished for it. So his enemy attestation is actually very powerful testimony to the veracity of the resurrection. Other appearances, of course, Peter's life was greatly converted. He went from an admitted skeptic to it to the, obviously very out there, putting in prison, a very powerful disciple and apostle. Same thing with James. As far as what we know from the New Testament, in the book of John, all of his brothers, while he was alive, didn't believe a word, didn't believe that he was the Messiah. They basically said, go off with your followers and stop being ashamed to us. And yet James had some form of an experience where he saw Yeshua and his life was changed. And he became the chief bishop of the Church of Jerusalem. So the origin of the faith, this is vitally important, because there's no reason for us to have a faith today in a first century carpenter who was the son of a carpenter that had one of the most common names in first century Israel at the time, with all the other messianic candidates that existed at his time that have since been forgotten or have two sentences written them about in history. You have this very obscure man that really did nothing to write home about while he was on the earth, at least from a rulership perspective, that we still have a faith in him today. It's a very powerful testimony to look at the existence of our faith in today's society, in the world today, and for thousands of years after him, despite the fact that his message was not one of taking things over by power or force, but changing the hearts of men to bring in peace and a restored society through however many years it's going to take through his message. So those are very powerful things there. And I give a summary and a conclusion, and believe it or not, as nerdy as it is, I have my final objection in the end of this is probably the longest one, and it actually goes through what's called the probability calculus, because there are some skeptics that actually use probability, mathematically speaking, probability to disprove the possibility that resurrection. David Hume wrote a book called On Miracles, I think, and he was, he was quoted now more than anyone else, pretty much as a skeptic from a miracles perspective, and says that miracles are by definition the most impossible and improbable things, and they're impossible to prove. Therefore, they're not, nothing that's proclaimed to be a miracle can ever essentially be true. So I go through the probability calculus on this as well to give an event in my information. So there's endnotes that has all the references of everything, 100 and I don't know. And this is just to let you guys know, I don't make any profit off of this book at all. There's 155 references of all the historical works. I don't make any profit off this book at all. If I had the ability to print 1,000 of them and give them away for free, I would. So whatever you guys end up doing with it, then it's very important. I think it's good for all of us to be able to defend our faith. So what do you guys got? That's pretty much the summation of it without going through it in vast detail.
What we got is we finish the service and then we have discussion. If anybody has questions, we leave it till just right after the service, another 10 minutes at the most.
Sure.
Are you able to stay on?
Yep, sure.
Yeah, I've got a really burning question here. I'll just wait till then. Thank you.
Yep.
That was excellent. And the way he is described, as I said, I've got one right here. I have read it, and all that he's saying is true. The thing that I like the best are the color pictures and the helps in color in there. I was very surprised to find those in this book, as well as the cover art. That costs money to put color pictures, especially diagrams, in a book like this. And hey, there they are. Thank you again. Yes, do we have, if you feel about giving this away, is there any way we could get a PDF?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I
Okay.
I have no problem with that whatsoever. I don't have a Kindle version of it. I hadn't had time to do that, believe it or not. It's not as simple as one might think. It doesn't go through the same formatting and converting a PDF to the Kindle thing. And of course, it doesn't come along with all the colored pictures, and everything gets messed up with the format. So I highly recommend having a paper form of it to carry around, but I can definitely email out in fact, how about this? I'll send it to Jackson, and then Jackson, you can just forward it to whoever wants it.
Sure. That's great. Just great. Okay, thank you. And now we'll call on the Heisen.
We pray together.
Our Father in the sky, may your name be sanctified.
May your reign be blessed, your will be done in sky and land. Continually give us our bread. Forgive us our sin debts, as we forgive the debt of those who sin against us. Do not bring us into the nets of the snare, and protect us from the evil one. Amen. The Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the Torah
I pledge allegiance to the Torah
of the kingdom of the beloved Son,
of the kingdom of the beloved Son,
and to the divine theocracy for which it stands,
and to the divine theocracy for which it stands.
one Eloha, one nation, one head,
One Eloah, one nation, one head.
one faith, one attitude, one goal,
One faith, one attitude, one goal.
one baptism, one communion,
One baptism, one communion.
ordained by Yahweh the Creator.
Ordained by Yahweh the Creator.
My nation is indivisible.
My nation is indivisible.
Heisen.
with
Can you scroll
divine,
a little bit?
yeah. With divine
With
liberty,
divine liberty, equitable justice,
with divine liberty, equitable justice, and eternal, oh, that's yours, sorry.
and eternal life for all.
And eternal
Amen.
life for all. Amen.
The leader blesses.
Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. In the name of Yeshua HaMoshiach, Prince of Peace. Amen.
The service is finito. Thank you for being with us today. And as has been our custom for the last few months, we'll take us some time right now to allow you opportunity to talk or to ask questions. And for this, we turn it over to our own Professor Smith.
Hey, thank you, Jackson, and thank you, Brother Adam. Thank you for all of the time and effort that went into putting this material together and putting it in a format that believers can use to try, with the Master's help, to convince those, and in particular, I think, in family and friends that we are concerned about for their eternal destiny, convince them that Yeshua existed, number one, and Yeshua is who he said he was. And number three, that Yeshua is the sole solitary pathway to the Father. And so this is a most critical mission for everyone who is in ministry. And to have those tools is, we're very grateful for that. Does anyone have something they would like to ask Adam?
Well, I have a burning question, as I mentioned. We had talked about this some years ago, and what is your opinion on, what would they call it, the Talpiot tomb, the Jesus family tomb?
So that's a complex question, as you know.
You don't need to answer it if you don't want.
No. It's okay. I'll give you my opinion. It just is shortened. I haven't done as intense study, probably nearly as much as some have done on this meeting on it. But I will say that I think I respect James Tabor for a lot of the stuff that he does. But I think, and I actually, I think I might have a section in here on that, Jackson. One of the objections that I have that relates to the bone boxes, I think specifically goes into, the Talpiot tomb. It's objection number 6 in the back. And it essentially goes through what evidence is provided in favor of the claim, specifically for the ossuary, not necessarily the tomb as a whole, but the Jesus ossuary that they call it, versus the evidence against the claim. And again, I provide the evidence, I provide the information, and so people can make their own conclusion off of it. My personal belief is that I don't think that the Jesus ossuary was that of Yeshua of Nazareth. But that's my personal conclusion. I have there's a great article, and I quoted a lot of the information here from it, that was published by Biblical Archaeological Society. And it has a lot more information on it. I also post a link, again, to try to be fair to the information. I post I'm sorry, not a link, but I give a reference to an article on their site that has critical information, that, people that were critical of the view that it's not his, right? So again, everyone just needs to take the information and weigh it out for themselves and decide.
Thank you. I'm a big believer in it. It just seems to me that the mathematical evidence of the people that are in there is conclusive. And there's one ossuary there of a Makia, who they don't know who that is. And I think I know who that is, just as obvious as can be. So either it was the biggest, the most lucrative hoax of the time, or it is the real thing. But maybe I didn't read in the back of the book what your objections there to it, but I sure will, because I'm really interested in that. And I think when a person is crucified, if he has any wealthy friends, they would have provided an ossuary before 3 days is over. They have to have that right away. And that's one of the objections, is that, why does he have a bone box when he was resurrected?